the Gespekwe Mi'kmaq Resource Council, which is collaboration between three large First Nations up in northern New Brunswick and in Gaspé. She's bringing her team to the team her passion and expertise in researching aquatic species and habitat. She grew up along the shores of the Restigouche River and believes it has inspired her career path. She describes her passion to specialize in science as being useful to the community and the watershed. And Caroline has been actively working in membership communities since 2014. She feels a sense of fulfillment in working in this job. And she also brings two-eyed seeing, which is going to be something important that comes up today. Should I explain that now, or is that something that you might go over?
I'll go over it quite briefly, but yeah, you can go ahead.
Well, your explanation is going to be better than mine because you live it every day, which is very inspiring and wonderful. So in this webinar, we'll be learning about remote sensing and participatory mapping during semi-structured interviews with community members. They're mapping past storm surge events and future sea level rise in the Eel River Bar First Nation. And with these methods, the Resource Council has identified vulnerable infrastructures and culturally significant areas as well that are going to be impacted by sea level rise. Awesome, I'll give the floor to you. Thank you so much.
So I'm not sure, do you see my PowerPoint right now?
No, I stopped the sharing, so you'll just have to reshare.
Oh, okay. Do I have to do something or?
The share screen is the green button at the bottom. I hope I didn't accidentally take away your sharing rights. Whoops.
And I'll try to make sure. So you can ask questions during the talk. I'll try to keep an eye on the chat box. Can everybody just unmute themselves as they wish, Zomi, or how does it work?
Maybe just during the presentation, if you could raise your hand or type in the chat, and that way we won't get any accidental noise, and then we'll unmute everybody again at the end.
Okay, so today is really just a webinar to show the case study and the work that we've been doing in the community of Ukpiganjik, a Mi'kmaq community in northern New Brunswick. I'll also talk a bit briefly about GMRC, the Gespekwe Mi'kmaq Resource Council, and who we are. Now I'm trying to get to the next slide. It's not working. Did that work?
Yes, looks good.
Okay, perfect. So GMRC is an AROM group. We were formed in early 2007. So there's a membership of 3 communities: Eel River Bar, Ukpiganjik, Restigouche, and Pabineau. What our mission and vision is really to make a difference for aquatic resources by providing both Mi'kmaq ecological knowledge and unbiased scientific research to shape and inform community members so they can make better evidence-based decisions in their daily lives, if it's regarding aquatic resources, habitats, or any threat or concern that community may find as concerning. So we're really there to serve our communities and to answer any questions they may have. So what I find very interesting with this job is that really our playground, or our area that we do study, are the 3 watersheds. So the Restigouche River watershed, the Eel River watershed, and the Nipisiguit River watershed, and the western part of the Bay of Chaleur. So really any species, or if it's coastal erosion or if it's sea level rise, all those impact our communities. So as an organization, we have to answer to those concerns and build our capacity and our research expertise in all these aspects of aquatic research. So we have multiple fish species that we look at. We also look at shellfish, and now we're looking at sea level rise. So this is our team. We're a team of 9 now. John Mervyn Vicaire, he's our executive director. We have Jessica Gideon. She's been there for quite a while now. She's our aquatic research technician. We also have Craig Isaac, that's the aquatic research technician, and we have a research assistant, Lloyd Arsenault, that joined us last year. We have our GIS specialist, Pascal Gosselin. In communications, we have Charlene Labilwa from Ukpiganjik and Brenda Martin as well, that's from Ukpiganjik. And then we have Miriam Lebeau, who just came on board in November, and she's our environmental engineer. So the 3 communities that we do serve are Lissagush, Eel River Bar, and Pabineau. And you can see the size of the different watersheds that we study. We conduct different research projects on eels, telemetry, freshwater lakes, coastal environments, eelgrass, striped bass, common clams. We pretty much go over all the species of concern in the area. We also do a lot of outreach with youth groups, participatory mapping with elders, with community members. We have a Fish Friends program as well. We usually do tree planting. So raising environmental awareness and education. What we try to incorporate in every single project that we do is to have 2 components. Yes, the applied research and the Western knowledge system of gathering data and measuring fish and sampling fish, but also bring in the Mi'kmaq ecological knowledge. So, and what we try to do is really braid those 2 knowledge systems together to get a bigger picture, a more holistic view of the ecosystem or the interactions that are ongoing. So 2-eyed seeing is learning to see from one eye with the strengths of Indigenous knowledge and ways of knowing, and from the other eye with the strengths of Western knowledge and ways of knowing. So it's really equally looking at a system or an ecosystem or sea level rise with both knowledge systems. So really just to incorporate and value both aspects in each of the projects that we do. Mi'kmaq knowledge doesn't have to be traditional and old information. It can be very contemporary. It can be something that you've seen yesterday, and that can be Mi'kmaq knowledge. So it's really from your experiences of being on the land, being in contact with the environment, and also that's information that's also passed down. Most of the information has been passed down orally through stories, legends, learned experiences, observation, and spiritual teachings. It relates to the identity, culture, and heritage of the Mi'kmaq people. We've had a Mi'kmaq protocol, the MEK protocol, so it's where we define the way that we're going to collect the data. And it really guides us when we're defining a project or we're designing a questionnaire to do some interviews with community members. So it's really a framework that guides us, and it's been reviewed by the ethical committee in Nova Scotia. And this protocol really kind of sets in stones our process of gathering the data and securing the data for our community members as well. So this is our process. So we usually plan the study, and this can work for any project. It can be sea level rise, it can be eelgrass restoration, it can be increasing our research capacity to study sturgeon. So it can be pretty much anything, but we always apply it to every project we do. So the first step is to plan the study. Then is to schedule interviews. And in the planning of the study, it's really defining the questions. So in the semi-structured interviews where we'll try to capture some of the information that coming from a Western view, we have these questions about, say, sturgeon. What is the prevalence of sturgeon in the Bay of Chaleur? That's a good question that we can ask, but then try to design the questions so experiences or community knowledge can emerge from storytelling and can give us an indication of abundance, frequency of sturgeon in the Bay of Chaleur. So that's one example. Then we go out, we have a team that does oral interviews. So they'll go and conduct interviews. Now in the new era, we'll try to do some online interviews to gather some MEK data. Then we digitize either the recording or the video. And then we'll write down the data. So we'll transcribe the interview, and then we'll do some validation and some analyses. And then we can interpret some of the information and then braid the Western knowledge with the community level knowledge or the MEK, and then emerge some patterns or have a more well-rounded view of the picture. And then we'll archive and secure the data on our servers. And then it really helps us identify future research needs, new species or concerns from community members that arose during the interview process, or even identify new areas that or ecosystems that we didn't look at in the past. We have a quite wide range of equipment. So for digitizing, we can do mapping with community members, and we can also scan and geo-reference those maps at the office, but we can also go in the field and gather mapping data. So we bring in the Western set of things with these technologies and equipment, and we gather new data in the field. With drones as well, we have mapping drones, and then we overlay that with the community level knowledge and the data or the historical data that we can't go gather in the field anymore. So, and then we overlay those maps and get a better picture of the situation. So this is the small watershed of Eel River Bar. There's different projects that the community works on. There's a habitat restoration project in the community where they're restoring salmon throughout the watershed. There's also some estuary work being done. There was a dam removal in 2010, and so there's been a lot of efforts to restore the estuary there. We did eelgrass planting, and now we're also looking at the effects of climate change, sea level rise, and coastal erosion. If you have any questions, just jump in at any time. So climate projections and potential impacts. So we're in the northern part of the province, but there's still some impacts of sea level rise and heat waves, especially in the last few weeks. We've seen it throughout the province of New Brunswick. So there's been an increase in hot days where there'll be some threat to vulnerable people. And also there can be new invasive species that benefit from changing or shifts in thermal regimes. There can be increased precipitation. We haven't seen that lately. We've been pretty dry, but increase in flooding can happen, erosion, damages to different infrastructure. Spring floods have been quite impressive in the last few years. And we'll see those increase in the future as well. There'll be increased storm events, either from post-tropical storms or storm surges, high winds, freezing rain. So we've seen that quite recently in the province as well. So you've probably seen this before. This is the province of New Brunswick projections from the provincial data set. Even though we're further north in the province, we still see an increase in warmer air temperatures in the future. So we're always looking at different scenarios where we're looking at 2050 2080 and 2100 for different projections in modeling climate change. So in the community of Eel River Bar, climate change will most likely lead to an increase in annual mean air temperature from almost 2 degrees Celsius to almost 9 degrees Celsius, and above 10 degrees Celsius up to 13.6 Celsius by 2100. That's going to change quite a bit. Not as much as further south, but still quite impactful. So the change in precipitation, again, is going to be a bit different on the coastal side of northern New Brunswick compared to southern New Brunswick. But still, for the short term, there'll be an increase in 8%, and 2050 to 2080, 13%, and by 2100, 17%. So we'll see not only just an increase in precipitation, but also an increase in the number and intensity of storms in the future as well. So there'll be recurring impacts of extreme weather. We'll see massive floods, storm surges, massive droughts as well. So these extreme events are going to be happening more frequently. Climate projections and potential impacts. So all these can factor into increasing sea level rise. Sea level rise is projected to be by 1 meter by year 2100. The increase of flooding and erosion will impact coastal communities. Ordinary higher watermark will be higher in 2100, and higher temperatures will reduce the presence of overwintering ice in the Bay of Chaleur as well. So the lack of presence of ice may cause more shoreline erosion on the coastal areas, and making the vulnerability much more vulnerable to storm surges as well. So the risk is really increasing for coastal communities that are linked to the coastal ecosystem and that have been either moved or displaced or settled on very low-lying areas. So increased flooding should be expected and planned for. So now that we do have these models, we have to build these adaptation plans with the new knowledge that we do have and projection. So low-lying areas are very vulnerable. Areas that are near watercourses are vulnerable as well, and areas that are either affected by tides or in coastal areas will be vulnerable as well. This is the community of Eel River Bar. That's a beautiful shot that we got with one of our drones. So as you'll see, it's a coastal community. It has a river coming through, the Eel River, and there's a sandbar as well. It's a coastal community, it's in a low-lying area, and it's affected by tides, and there's a watercourse. So all the factors making this community vulnerable are there. Sea level rise will impact this community, and climate change will also impact the community. You can see here the Eel River estuary coming out where the bridge is. Recently they've installed, there was a massive storm surge in 2010, and they've installed a seawall below the bridge here, down to the western point towards Dalhousie, to try and limit impacts from storm surges. When there's an east wind, high tides, it's a bad combination for the community. So what we did in our first year, so what we did last year was the vulnerability assessment. So we knew there was some impact of sea level rise in the community, that storm surges might be more frequent. So we really pulled all the existing data from GeoNB, climate change models that were provided by Uranos. We mapped the current infrastructure. So we did remote sensing and in-field assessments. So what we couldn't do with remote sensing, we went out in the field and gathered. And then we also did some interviews with community members to identify all the other infrastructure and community services that were provided. We mapped out past flooding events with the help of community members. We conducted Mi'kmaq ecological knowledge interviews. We created a steering committee, and we hosted some information sessions. So the community, as you saw in the drone photos, is really set on a strip of land that's very low lying. It's marine and river deposits along marshlands. The strip of land corresponds to a convex section of the Eel River meander and is found just downstream of a tidal estuary. Due to the location, most of its facilities are located at low elevations in the community. With our remote sensing data and the LiDAR data that was provided by the province, we found that most of the community of Eel River Bar is located within 6 meters elevation above the current relative sea level. So it's a very low-lying community, and there's been a lot of fill in the community to raise it and to raise some homes a bit higher. But there's been a lot of flooding in the past. So this is an example. This is a photo that was provided by a community member. This is a storm surge in 2010. It was one of the most devastating ones in the community. The community is to the west, and so when there's east wind with the high tide, these storm surges happen, and there's a lot of erosion and flooding. So what is at risk in a community that's so low lying, and that with the projected climate change and sea level rise, what can we see or forecast that's going to be impacted? Well, there's water infrastructure. There's all the stormwater, wastewater, drinking water systems, pump stations that are already linked and lowered to the ground. Those are likely to be flooded. There's coastal infrastructure with like the bridge that we saw, the seawall that was also there, boat launches that the community member used to go harvest, roads, services. All that relocation and redesigning will cost some money. There's all the properties, community level services, but also everybody's homes. Other services and buildings that provide services to the community. Saltwater intrusion might happen. Drinking water supplies, storm backflow from stormwater, sewage systems. And then there's also coastal natural infrastructure. So there might be some coastal squeeze in the community. And there might be some erosion as well. There's also wetlands, dunes, beaches, cultural activities that occur in the areas that are going to be impacted by sea level rise, medicinal plants that are found in coastal waters as well. Those will all be impacted. So the tools that we're currently using in the community was the remote sensing data. And we used the flooding scenarios that were provided by the province, and we looked at the elevation of the community. So we identified vulnerabilities, critical infrastructure and communities, and where different services were located based on different scenarios and based on different flooding scenarios based on the elevation. We used the LiDAR data. The LiDAR data is provided for the entire province of New Brunswick, and it's high resolution topographical maps that help us identify these areas that are prone to flooding. So the province has provided some documents for us to be able to carry out this project, and they have the adaptation planning guidebook for New Brunswick communities. So that's available on the website from the province, and the coastal community adaptation decision tree. So that's when you're planning your adaptation plan, you can go through that process and see what type of infrastructure or adaptation measures you can take for your community or your municipality. So we looked at different flooding scenarios. So they were representative of the impact of storm surge flooding. So it's assuming that there's going to be a full moon or a new moon cycle with a very high tide. So in the model, what's been used, and it's an acronym that you'll see in the maps that are coming up, it's HHWLT. So it means higher high water at larger tides. So that accounts for some uncertainty, but then it gives you also a buffer of measurement, and you'll see those scenarios on the maps coming up. So the HHWLT value was added to sea level rise estimates that were documented in storm surge return periods from the different scenarios and flooding scenarios from the Climate Change Secretariat. So the future milestones that we're looking at is 2055, 2085, and 2100. I think in the maps it says 2050, 2080, and 2100. So we've mapped sea level rise. So a while ago, if you can picture the drone picture, the bridge in the community is here. This is the bar stretch. Can you see my mouse when I'm pointing at stuff? I'm not sure.
Yep.
Okay, good. Okay. So you can see here the Bay of Chaleur is to the north. So this is not, should have a north sign here. So the Bay of Chaleur is over here. The bar stretch is this turquoise color, and most of the community is here. And this area here, this little peninsula that goes into the estuary, is called Blueberry Point. The village of Charlotte is over here, and Dalhousie is further to the west. So as we can see, the light green is the wetlands, naturally occurring flood scenarios that happen currently. It's quite marshy in this area, and it's affected by tides as well. So you'll see the different colors and levels of blue are the different scenarios of the HHWLT. So we have 2050 and 2100, and the darker the color, the further in the future the scenario is. So by 2050, we see that most of the community is affected by sea level rise. So all these black dots are infrastructure. They can be residential homes or community level services. So we collected data during interviews as well. So we went to the community members, we had some printed maps, and then we also had a mapping tool, which I'll show you in a couple slides, where we really asked them, okay, can you recall past flooding events in your lifetime? Have you heard of past flooding events from your parents or your grandparents? And see what the flooding history of the community was. They've talked also a lot about storm surges and how those affect the community. They've talked about the wetlands and where they were and how they were filled and how they were used. Infrastructure, the history of developing infrastructure in different areas that were built over time, new areas that were developed as well. Community level services, and many services are offered within the band council building. So there's about 15 to 20 services in one building. So that's a very important building where a community member is well served. So it's very important to assess how that is going to be impacted by sea level rise. Coastal assets, different wharfs, boat launches, location that the community use a lot, harvesting sites, medicinal plants. Shoreline changes over time. What they can recall where different plants were in the past and where they are today, if they've observed any changes in the high water mark, or in their, sometimes it's very connected through their own home. So has their shoreline receded? Do they have less land in front of their home or not? Past adaptation measures, so more recently there was a seawall, but then what was put in prior to that? So fill, erosion, if there was any rocks that were put in, weirs, was there some wood or something installed in the past to limit erosion and the impact of waves. We had a lot of information sessions with the community members, and we're still doing that. Now we, the new era of this pandemic, we're gonna have to be creative in the way that we do engage with our community members and find some ways to inform them and really have open discussions about sea level rise and future adaptation measures for the community. And so we'll get creative in the coming months to really make sure that we get the information across, but we also get a lot of information from community members, since it's their own adaptation plan. We've had some participatory mapping, so events where we do information gathering on paper maps that we then digitize. And then we've developed a tool where we can go to the community and gather information directly on a system online. So we can create shapefiles, create data points directly on maps, zoom in to the person's home, show the satellite map, different layers, show the flooding scenarios, and overlay those, and then really have a good discussion with the different homeowners. So this is our visualizing tool. So you'll see it's the same map of the community that you saw in the previous slide. So this is our interface online. We have our logo, and then we can save the data after digitizing. We can zoom in, we can zoom out, we can create a polygon, so or a line feature, or just a data point. And then we can enter fields and comments from the person directly in the fields. We can select and deselect layers, buildings, so there's the black dots, parcels of land, areas of concerns, wetlands, and then showcase the different scenarios on each of those layers. So this is the year horizon 2100. So as you'll see here, Blueberry Point is mostly underwater by then. The bar stretch as well, connecting the community of Charlotte and Eel River Bar. And many homes are affected by then. So this area is the most impacted in the community. This is Miller Road, and this is also part of the community as well. So this area is very safe for development. So this is a zoom in of Blueberry Point and the shoreline of the community, either in the Bay of Chutar or along the estuary. So many homes expected to experience sea level rise as early as 2050. By 2050, 50 homes will be impacted, likely impacted by sea level rise floods associated to storm surge or just increase in water levels.
I'm just going to break in for a second. Looks like Brandon has a question.
Oh, go ahead.
Hello.
Hi.
I have a couple questions, but I'm really I'm curious about this, I guess, this participatory mapping. I think this is a really innovative way of getting feedback on your adaptation work, and I was curious about a couple of the components of it. And I guess one was like, when it comes to, let's look at Blueberry Point, like you're talking about, do you have a discussion with the homeowners that are in this area about what's specifically at risk? And like, how does that conversation go? What's the approach there?
So it's sometimes it can be a quite difficult conversation because we don't want to do fear mongering either. We just want to provide some information on what future climate scenarios are saying. But yeah, when we have a meeting with a homeowner, say it's this home right here, we can zoom in to that lot, deselect the flood map, and then they can talk about their property, the floods that happened in the past since they've been in that home, if they've had water in their basement, if they were impacted during the storm surge or not. And then we can overlay the different scenarios. We overlay to 2050, then we'll overlay 2100. And yeah, it's kind of concerning most times when we do talk with people, but it's just a lot of questions, and most of the times they're like, well, what can I do? What do we have to move? Do we have to relocate our homes? Can we do green infrastructure? What can we do? So at this moment in time, we're in the second year of the project, and we're talking about doing some adaptation planning and what solutions can be done in preparation for this 2050 horizon. So we're trying to take more the proactive approach than the fear approach.
Awesome. Yeah, that would be a very difficult conversation to have, I could imagine, as a homeowner to maybe for the first time get to see these projected elevations and see, you know, what the impact could be in the future. And do you think going forward that I guess the appetite is there from the community, let's say Blueberry Points specifically, to really sit down and go over adaptation approaches and help maybe identify a few with you at the table?
Yes. So the community is very eager for us to start discussing about what the options are for, especially Blueberry Point. I'll talk about it in a couple slides, but the community is already planning some development, residential development here. I don't know if you can see my mouse.
Yeah.
And here, so there's going to be a brand new residential development. So I'm not aware yet if it's going to be new homes for people that are waiting for housing, or if it's going to be people that are going to be moved or relocated. But there will be a plan in the future for moving some people to other locations where they'll be less at risk and less vulnerable to sea level rise. But yes, this summer and hopefully this fall, we'll be discussing with both our steering committee, chief and council, and community members to look at what are the options for the community, what really brainstorm and see what's out there, what other communities have done to adapt, and what type of green infrastructure they can implement in their communities to really either slow down the impact or buffer a bit of wave action, so hopefully they don't get flooded in the future. So that discussion is going to happen shortly. And yes, most people are very concerned with their property. Sometimes the discussions that we have is, okay, so this is my home, but by 2050, I'll be close to retirement or I'll be gone, but my kids, they'll have my home, and then it won't be a safe place for them. So that's the concern that most people do exhibit. It's that home legacy and how they can give that to their children, but maybe it's not going to be a safe place. So that's the most difficult discussion.
No, thank you. That's extremely interesting. That's the first time I've seen this this kind of participatory mapping approach, and I I'm really impressed by it. I think that's an awesome way to engage with the community, and it may be something, especially with, you know, our current COVID situation, that'll serve you really well in kind of continuing that discussion with the community. So very,
Absolutely, yeah.
very
And
innovative.
hopefully we can use a platform like Zoom, or we have Google Meet at the office as well. And with more tech savvy community members, we can do this one-on-one, share the screen, and they can talk about their home, and we can gather more data about past flooding as well in the community and what their concerns are. So it's going to be interesting for sure to continue down this road.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you. So affected buildings by sea level rise impacts. So we've also done the maps in the different scenarios, but then we've highlighted in red which buildings will be affected when. So it gives the community members and chief and council a better idea of which homes are more urgently in need of finding adaptation measures than others. And maybe that can be part of our timeline where we do come up with different adaptation measures for the community itself. If you see here in the bottom table, by 2050, there's about 50 houses or buildings that are affected. But then by 2100, it almost triples. And then if we go in the most severe scenario, 178 buildings will be affected. So this is the type of data that we've collected so far. This is just an excerpt of the data, but it can be information that's either point-based, and each point has a series of comments and polygons, and different line features have also comments from community members in different areas. So this is on top of the data that was provided from the province or anything that's available on GONB, but this is community level data. So this helps us draw a better picture of the past and the present, to where we're going and what the current situation is, what was impacted by the storm surge in 2010 and what wasn't. So it gives us a good idea. So the different adaptation measures, so it's really our focus for this year is to help the community build its resiliency and infrastructure and natural resources. So by providing just the different scenarios to chief and council or community members, well, then everybody's aware of the future climate scenarios and the different sea level rises and the levels of flooding that may happen in their own community. So really every time that they'll be faced with a decision or financing or a new development project, well, they'll know which areas are affected in the short term. So investment, development, housing, land use planning can all be things that can factor in sea level rise. So then it becomes a more daily concern where you're like, okay, well, sea level rise is at the forefront now. So when we're making decisions about pretty much anything in the community, you can look, okay, how is sea level rise going to impact that? And then they can just make better decisions based on this scientific data. It's really interesting. And Okanagan is already taking measures to build a more resilient community with that residential development that they are building outside the impact zone of sea level rise. So it's very good that they've started on that. And upcoming efforts from GMRC will be to facilitate these discussions with community members and really share as much information as we can. So if you have any more questions, don't hesitate. We're on here for a little bit, so thank you.
Thank you so much, Carolyn. And we can allow everybody just the ability to talk if they choose. It might take a second for it to apply to everybody, but please go ahead.
Hi, it's Courtney speaking.
Hi, Courtney.
Hi, I'm wondering if this webinar will be posted after it's finished for public viewing.
Yes, all of the webinars in the series will be on our YouTube channel, and everybody who is registered is going to receive that as soon as it's available.
Amazing, thank you. And I sent an email. I'm planning to write an article on this, and I'd just like to get your permission before doing so. Is that okay?
Yeah, are you going to do a article on the 3 webinars from NBEN or just this one?
I was planning on just this one originally, but
Yeah,
if,
that's fine.
okay, awesome.
Yeah,
Thanks.
make sure you share it with us too, so then we can share it on our GMRC Facebook page.
Mhm. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I have a question from Sebastien that says, I was wondering where you found the financing for the adaptation planning.
Okay, so because our project is in New Brunswick, it was funded by the New Brunswick Environmental Trust Fund. So I think, and I don't work for the province, but I think the province is mandated, or they want every community in New Brunswick to have an adaptation plan, and every municipality. So I think there's ample opportunity to request your funding through the NBETF fund. They should be having a call this fall in November as well. To develop adaptation plans.
Omer, do you have a question? Okay, and Brandon, did you have another question or comment?
Hey, thank you. Yeah, maybe, well, a couple of questions. Maybe a quick comment on that question from Sebastian. This is Brandon Love, and I work with the Climate Secretariat here at the province of New Brunswick. And Carol Ann is exactly right. We have the capacity each year to take on a certain number of climate change adaptation plans. So we usually try and organize around the high level risks around the communities. So on the coast, obviously a community like Eel River, where they're threatened through sea level rise and storm surge and stuff, they're a high risk community. The example inland would be something like a St. John River community that experiences a lot of pretty intense flooding regularly, or other similar communities that experience those kind of things. So we do try and prioritize which communities we at least target to get an adaptation plan on the ground and running, but we encourage a community to apply to the ETF if they do think they want to undertake that process for sure. The question I had was for Carol, was actually on a slide you showed earlier, and it was just out of curiosity, mainly because I was trying to understand your two-eyed seeing approach. I think it's very interesting. When you look at like a habitat restoration project, and I think you maybe mentioned one on the Eel River Bar about a river restoration because of a dam dismantling.
Mm-hmm.
Is when you do something like that, I guess I'm just curious how you apply the two-eyed seeing approach to get the most, I guess, complete restoration on the ground. Like, how does that work?
It's really hard to do two-eyed seeing because there's no step 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of how you approach that. It's really just in the way that we approach projects. And for the example, the habitat recovery for the Eel River, there was a dam dismantle. You can see the old dam here, actually, in the black line. So really to discuss with community members about what was the ecosystem prior to the dam being installed, and finding metrics in that knowledge of habitat quality, different species diversity, and species abundance based on storytelling. So it's it's really interesting to discuss with community members, and then what they were doing as kids, and you know, what the ecosystem was like in the Eel River before the dam, and then during the dam, and then after the dam removal, and what the estuary looked like at different phases, and then how we're trying to get back to pre-dam ecosystem quality, but we're still a ways away from that. But it's really interesting to kind of, I have this whole Western knowledge approach to things. So when I do discuss with community members, sometimes they'll just be talking about clam digging or something else, but then in my mind, I'm always thinking about, okay, so there was a good clam population structure. There was probably all these age groups of clams, and what were the different sizes, and what was the abundance, and they would tell stories. And so just bringing that together in that sense is how that project could be two-eyed seeing. But there's different examples as well where we've had, you know, the fuller picture with a community knowledge, for sure.
No, that's really, it's really interesting. It seems like an extremely effective way to represent the community in the design or in the response to a problem.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe something that we could all learn from like the provincial perspective on adaptation, because I know when we talk about flooding and erosion, a lot of the time we talk about how it impacts development, which is obviously important, or infrastructure or core services. But as you touch on, like that, some of those other livelihood factors that could be integrated into that response, and maybe you could work towards reestablishing clam populations alongside your maybe your protection of the residential or the infrastructure in the area.
Mm-hmm.
It's just something that when you were discussing it, it caught my attention as it's almost a natural infrastructure, like almost a core principle probably that should be incorporated in natural infrastructure, is that two-eyed seeing approach.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. I find more and more people are being aware of two-eyed seeing, and then finally valuing ecosystem knowledge by Mi'kmaq people and other First Nations as well. So yeah, it's really interesting. Because sometimes we do projects without involving community, and it's not really a bottom-up approach. It's really like you fly in, you grab your data, and you leave, and then you do up this wonderful report, but you're really missing the bigger picture, and how that can be either useful to the community, or something that happened in the community that affected your results, but you're completely disconnected from the community, so you don't have that knowledge that they have by living, breathing, and coexisting with the land.
Thank you so much. We have a comment from William that says, I agree, Brandon. Etwap Munk, or two-eyed seeing, should be integrated into all areas of society and community development. Jeff, I'm not sure if you had a comment as well. It looks like you're unmuted.
No, I was just going to ask how one goes about discussing with the community the increase in risk over time, because obviously there's a certain risk in 2020, but with each passing decade, the risks increase. And I don't know how that kind of discussion would take place with the community.
Because it is an abstract concept of you know, oh, it's so far down the line that it's kind of abstract, and especially climate change, I find it to be sometimes of an abstract concept. But the Mi'kmaq communities, they've always looked at 7 generations in terms of future or past. So I find that, you know, when you bring it back down to so many generations from now, you know, that risk will be higher for that generation. And it's not just in 100 years. you know, in the short term or this longer term. But in terms of generational time frame, I think that's easier to grasp for community members. And so they can see, okay, well, grandkids or great grandkids will really, really be affected by this, and that risk is going to increase over time. So that's an easy concept, I find, for the community to understand.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. It looks like Omer, you're also unmuted if you'd like to speak. Perhaps not. Awesome. It looks like we're just right at 2 o'clock. Are there any other questions or comments that anybody has?
Is it possible that this presentation is available on the web, or is it accessible, or?
Yes, so now all of these webinars will be uploaded, and everybody who registered will get a notification. And tomorrow there's a French language one as well. So both languages of all three in the series will be available.
Thank you very much for it. It was very clear, a very clear explanation. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, everybody. I think that takes us about to the end here. And Carol Ann has been generous enough to also include her email and phone number on that last slide. So hopefully if you need to be in touch, you had a chance to get that down. And we really appreciate you coming for the day. And Carol Ann, thank you so much for sharing all of this information with us. It was really appreciated. The French language one will be happening tomorrow in case you know anybody who missed it but would like to still join. Thank you, everybody.